DK, can you elaborate a little bit more on that when you talk about
Yeah.
displacement and your concerns about that?
Sorry?
I said, can you elaborate a little bit more about your concerns around displacement? What do you see happening?
Yeah. My concerns, I think, come from, I just got back from Puerto Rico last week. I was there for 3 months. What I'm seeing back home is uh, post, right, Hurricane Maria in 2017, and then me spending a full year in Mitchell Street in 2018 and happening. I see a lot of people sort of leaving their land, it being purchased by outsiders, by people who have other bigger interests. For example, in Puerto Rico specifically, Monsanto or big corporations or the cryptocurrency folks are just buying space up and taking up all the space, right? And it's shifting the culture. So I'm just sort of fearful of that displacement happening as well in Mitchell Street, and one of the richest places that I think we have culturally in the city of Milwaukee.
CK, we're looking at some, can you tell us just some of what we're seeing real quick?
Yeah, so this was a program that it actually first started in Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Myself and a couple of friends created a pop-up food restaurant called the Iron Board Cafe, where we went to places that were incommunicado and brought food to just hang out and chat with people and see what the needs were, and to hopefully connect the folks with certain needs that they might have. So it was called the Iron Board Cafe because an iron board was the only thing that fit into our vehicle, we used it as a table to drive around Puerto Rico. So after I was awarded the residency, I brought that same model into the library, but it was as a form of cultural, like connecting folks with Puerto Rican culture. I was stationed at the basement of the library for a full year, and in that full year, during the summer, I was cooking Puerto Rican meals like rice and corned beef, empanadillas, tostones, things with plantains. And at the same time, I would ask the families and the kids that were in the space to create a artwork or something artistic of that week. For example, in this picture, it was mask making that week. So the families would make a mask, and then we would exchange it for a Puerto Rican dish, right? So the goal was to culturally connect families with Puerto Rican dishes or things that they might not have been exposed to before, but also teaching them that like their time spent on something is worth, in exchange of not necessarily money, but your craft and your time is worth something. And we did that for a full month in Mitchell Street. Yeah, so that's the photos. It's a second rendition of what the Iron Board Cafe was in Puerto Rico.
We have a really good question here from Virginia, again, that she poses. Are there any effective anti-displacement efforts on the horizon for Mitchell Street, or are there folks pushing back against that displacement?
That might lie outside of the expertise of the.
That's a good question. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there is anti-displacement work happening around the city. I know List Milwaukee has created a fund for it, and there's people who are looking at it for sure. I think, to that end, Regit, to move into the metaphor that you just used of Mitchell Street being a dance or cities being a dance, and CK, some of the conversations we've had, dance for people, and actually there used to be on the library, which had been used by a dance troupe. They had different on the windows, different dance styles. They had ballet folklorico, they had breakdancing, salsa, jazz. So what dancing means to different people can be different. Like if you are twerking next to someone who's doing ballroom dance, CK, you might be familiar with that. It
Yes.
can feel like that it's not compatible. A lot of times, like in these kind of cultural conversations, a lot of times people will like, I don't know. So there is absolutely all kinds. It is a dance, but there's so many different kinds of dance forms, all of which are rooted in different cultural traditions. And I think that's sometimes where the dissonance comes, because as much as we discuss Mitchell Street as a place of cultural richness, it can also be a place of cultural divide. Like I have a friend who grew up in Milwaukee, who's Mexican, and he's, I asked him, have you ever been to Anmol, the Pakistani restaurant, which is my favorite restaurant? He's been like, it smells great, but I don't know if that food's for me. And there's that kind of attitude, and it's totally understandable. It's that there's that kind of, those boundaries are in place. So can you guys, before we move to Q&A, can you talk a little bit about sort of some of the boundaries that then exist when you have people dancing together, and some of those inherent politics that exist within that?
So I'm just gonna, when you dance as a language, right? It's like a language, except the body embodies. It's embodied, your body does that. There's a word that dancers use called counterpoint. And what that does is when you are next to another person, you know how to deal, even with, if your language is different, you don't just end up banging into someone. You know how to maneuver around that person. It's an embodied knowledge. But at the same time, what you have in Mitchell Street are the buildings. The buildings are dancing too, right? And that's the one which gives certain structure to the way the dances lay out. So these are all stores. Think of how you enter into the store. There's a particular rhythm, a choreography to it. The store windows tell you what you do. Then you enter, and then there's like a sound, you enter into that, and there's a particular way you move through the store. So it's not just, even though I'm dancing some kind of dance and someone else is having a different cultural experience, it's also brought together by the physical artifact that is there, which is kind of built a long time ago, but it still remains. It's a marketplace. And so I feel like even though there is a diversity, I mean, I go in there and I look at all the windows. And each of those windows are, as I said, a long time ago, it's a wormhole into another culture, into another world. And they're presenting themselves to the public in the front. However, when the public walks in, no matter what, I mean, I've seen in the Indian store, Africans coming in for their food because there is a common food that they go for. Indians going into Latino places because there are food that they share in common. What you have in this kind of intricate dance between the buildings, the people, and the culture is this notion of counterpoint. This kind of, I accept you, I see who you are, and I make that space. That is positive. That's incredibly encouraging and positive for me.
Cindy, let's get you into the conversation as well. As a business owner, as CK talks about change and the concerns associated with displacement, what are your thoughts as a business owner as you see where Mitchell Street is today and where it's headed? Are there thoughts you can share from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm hoping for the best. Like all of us, we're all afraid with the coronavirus that's going on. I worry that, we might not be open very long, but I'm praying that we don't. There is a lot of diversity, and we don't just have, the Mexican people that come in here. We do have all different cultures that come in, and they'll say, "Oh, I've never seen this before. What's that?" And we'll go on to explain to what it is. But I'm really hoping for a change down Metro Street. I see that they're remodeling a lot of buildings, which is good. And just praying for it to get better than, it's not like how it used to be. I grew up down here. It used to be called Bridal Alley. I mean, it was all Polish people. You had your Sears, the Grand, you had Buddy Squirrel, George Webb. And it's sad that it's not like that, but that's just the way of life. Things change.
Indeed. We are getting word from Command Central that we're going to start moving to Q&A pretty soon. All of our attendees, you're going to be promoted to panelists so that we can get into a bit of a conversation collectively. Keisha's going to take care of that for us. And so as we start to get into Q&A, we want to invite our attendees into the conversation. And so feel free to jump in, and we'll follow Zoom protocols and make sure we acknowledge folks who are looking to participate, but certainly unmute yourselves and pose some questions to the panelists. Adam, you want to start, get us into Q&A with some summary kinds of questions and thoughts?
Yeah, I have a kind of a specific question for you, Arijit, and Cindy and or Jorge. And CK, if you want to weigh in too, because you have a presence on Mitchell Street as well. Mitchell Street has a lot of historically designated buildings. I mean, it's a historically designated main street, which basically means that a lot of the buildings are sort of come up to a standard of where their blueprints originally were and what the plans for the buildings originally were. Sometimes that makes it really, really expensive for building owners to take care of their own properties. So, you need to have very specific kinds of contractors. So if you have enough money to do renovation, if you don't have a ton of money, your building sometimes can just kind of fall into deterioration because you don't have enough money to keep up the historical, even though there are tax credits, the historical integrity, whatever. Can you talk? And that's always been something that's been sort of on my mind of like, is it a cage, the historic designation that prevents the street from developing, or is it something that reinforces a character that's really important to its identity? I don't know. I'm of two minds about it.
And we might need to pick on Kristen from the Wisconsin Historical Society. She may have some thoughts about that as well. Not to put you on the spot, Kristen.
All right, maybe we can let's go to someone else's question. That's better.
A little bit on that. We are at a very important point in our culture to really begin to talk about that. Historic preservation originally was about preserving. There was this word called significance or integrity, which was used as a way to kind of put a benchmark at a time when it was built. And that is extremely problematic. Because if we always talk about origin stories of a certain historic building, it always comes back to the German and Polish moment. So the heritage of Mitchell Street always begins at that moment. However, I think there's a bunch of us who are really fighting to think about what intangible heritage and heritage really means. So for instance, if you look at some of the stores, let's say AP Foods, it is not historically significant in the sense that it was built by a German person at a certain time in the century. But what it does is it brings in a certain different immigrant culture into a German built building, which then creates this kind of hybrid condition. And for that, I would say that's a historically significant moment of space. The problem here is there is a lot of money for historic preservation. I think what we have to really, and this is a community issue, we have to fight against the notion of historic preservation and the significance we're talking about stops at a certain point in history, which always turns out to be Anglo-American history. So that's the issue here. It's not the preservation which the problem is. The problem is, when do you think is historic significant? What is historically significant?
I knew there was a reason we invited you, Regent.
Other folks, jump in with some questions.
I want to, if I can, address this question.
Go for it.
In the first one that's on the food and culture becoming teachable classroom topic. I think in my latest research, I'm doing some work around a specific dish, a Puerto Rican meal. It's the corned beef, Puerto Rican corned beef. It's like, why did canned corned beef come to Puerto Rico and how, right? So I think food and culture can be a topic if you do research on specific dishes and trace its lineage as to how it arrived to a certain place. Right now, this research has taken me down an alley of actually corned beef came to Puerto Rico in the 16th century through the transatlantic slave trade. And it was used to feed slaves within the cane fields in Puerto Rico. So, right, and it's now a staple of our culture and it's in our country. So food can definitely lead you to teachable moments if you look behind like how and why it arrived to and become where it is.
Can I also say something about the teachable food moment, which I think should be thought of? So food actually, what it does is it brings back memory. When we talk about history, we oftentimes talk about written history. What has people written? What's there in an archive? But in reality, we carry history inside our body. and think about smelling something and remembering your grandmother's kitchen or when you grew up. So in a lot of ways, immigrants have used the smell and food as a way to kind of recreate their world in a new space. So for instance, so when we talk about food and we talk about Mitchell Street, what we have to also talk about is how the body, our individual bodies are repositories of memory and heritage and culture, and that's getting activated when you go into these streets. So that's another reason why it's a heritage street, you know?
That's kind of a maybe because it's a great place to end. And Jorge, can you talk just a little bit about how, I mean, in some ways, like the food that you make is an archive of your family. It's an archive. It's something. I mean, how many generations of bakers is it?
Oh, I'm the fourth generation baker. My father, my grandfather, my great grandfather, we're all in the trades and all in the business. I have numerous cousins and relatives throughout Mexico and Texas and different parts of the United States that are bakers and that come from the same lineage, you know, same old world style of baking. And as far as like our restaurant part, my parents traveled throughout their lives. They've always traveled to different countries. So they've always gone for like the cuisine, see what they can incorporate, see what they can bring back, see what we can use and, you know, make it our own. So even though some of our dishes are staple dishes, a lot of them have infusions of, you know, different cultures or different, you know, ethnicities, you know, that my parents, you know, through their travels have discovered that, you know, it works for them.
So are you saying, Jorge, that as a fourth generation baker, in the spirit of historic preservation, that the state should pay your rent every year entirely? That, like for real, like here's a really, I can't imagine a world in which Lopez Bakery doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I would hate to imagine one where the current strains of the pandemic, like, you know, like you guys need to be part of Milwaukee or else we are not Milwaukee.
We did struggle during this pandemic shutdown. We went through some hard times, you know, especially with our employees not working. You know, it's a stressful time for everybody. But we just done what we've always done, you know, hard work, perseverance, you know, a little elbow grease, some time and effort, you know, and that's what it takes to succeed.
Maybe a little lard too with the tamales.
That's what gives it the flavor. Except our vegetarian ones; those are all vegetable.
God bless you, Jorge.
Absolutely. Command Central is telling us that we need to wrap up our formal portion of the discussion. We are at the 1 o'clock hour, a couple of minutes past. Virginia, I do want to encourage you to jump in and pose your question, though, which is about cultural landscapes. And I'll try to do it justice. But the fundamental question is, you know, we're not often sharing these rich stories of shifting cultural landscapes. How can we do a better job of that? What can we do as a city? How can we talk about this as educators? What do we need to do to help make sure to continually preserve the richness of these cultural landscapes?
I could just speak to that a little bit. I think even introducing the concept more, which our region does talk about more than anyone, I think, in Milwaukee. But there is a whole realm of cultural landscapes nationally and around the world. And I think that we could first just maybe try to connect more to the concept and see what other people are doing. For example, there's an organization called the Cultural Landscape Foundation. So they get involved in defining what cultural landscapes are. And also there are many types, like Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, which is the oldest continuously inhabited city in North America of the Acoma. That's a cultural landscape that they've focused on making sure that we are aware of and preserving in some way. So it isn't just buildings. I think it's more like we've gotten hung up on historic preservation as buildings. And the another cultural landscape is the motel where where Martin Luther King did some of his organizing. So, I mean, there's a lot of cultural landscapes in Milwaukee. And I think we're beginning to think of them as historic places, but when they're compared with a building, and especially like we just said, like a certain style of building, like people will say, well, that building doesn't have any, you know, curlicues on it. Why would we be saving that building? So, and if you think of a place as a building, it's different. I mean, many of what we're talking about here are places where you get a vibe. It's not just the structure of the place.
Yeah,
Um,
I think in a lot of ways the notion of historic preservation as preserving buildings is a cage that's killing our city. So
I don't think of it that extremely. I think there's a value
that's
of,
okay. I was just saying what I thought.
yeah. I just don't agree, but I don't think it's that severe as far as some buildings are really worth keeping their embodiment.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying that the power of white nostalgia as an engine of decision making is just really, it's like pervasive, and it's sort of the default. So I guess so it's not the buildings that are the problem, but it's rather those that fetishize them.
Yeah, you know, Adam, there are no cages that's killing us. It's us who are killing
I
us.
know.
And the thing here is, like, you know, if you think about the Mitchell Street and talk about the tremendous Latin, Polish, now South Asian, African heritage, especially to the concept of cultural landscape, what you're talking about is not about permanence and building, but about displacement and dislocation. That our heritage is about movement, is about dislocation, about our thing. Buildings give the wrong impression. Buildings seem like history and culture is like there and stands there, and it's always cultural landscape, spaces in between buildings, how we traverse it, move through it, gives us the sense of mobility. You know, when I work in Sherman Park or other neighborhoods, if you say what is the cultural land, what is his heritage of African Americans out there? No, there isn't, because it was built by the Germans. But in reality, the heritage is, if you look at displacement, at dislocation as a lens, you suddenly begin to see the entire space as a heritage of the African American population, in this case, the Latin who live there.
Awesome.
So
Awesome,
I
folks.
feel like there is a way to see a heritage, and we don't see that in the Historic Preservation Commission.
Sure. Well, we thank you for your time today. Adam, why don't you take us out? We've got a discussion next week, and then we're going to have a table talk for educators on July 31st. You want to talk about next week a little bit, Adam?
Yeah, we're going to be back next Wednesday, the Wednesday following. Next week, we're going to be discussing the Hmong cultural pathways of food in Milwaukee a little bit. And then the week after, we're still nailing it down, but the conversation we're looking to have is connected to urban agriculture and the deep lineage of urban agriculture within the African-American community, both in Milwaukee and other places. So yeah, then on the 31st, we're having a table talk for educators in the evening. Maybe last time we did it at 8 p.m. and regretted it, so it might be earlier. So look out for a new time, but we'll see. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. And everyone on the Zoom, stay for like a minute. We're just gonna stop broadcasting on Facebook, and then we can digest a little bit.